Picture a country that suddenly decides it wants to stop, depending on its biggest rival for the materials that power almost everything it builds. That is exactly what is happening in Washington right now. Rare earths, lithium, cobalt, tungsten, scandium, magnets. These are not obscure commodities anymore. They are the raw ingredients of missiles, fighter jets, electric motors, smartphones, wind turbines, and the entire artificial intelligence build-out. And for decades, one country quietly became the world's factory for almost all of it. China. Not because China simply has more rocks in the ground, although it does have a lot. The real story is what happens after the rocks come out of the ground. Refining, separating, smelting, turning raw ore into usable industrial material. That is the part of the supply chain China spent 30 years building almost unnoticed, while the rest of the world focused on cheaper prices, instead of who actually controlled the process. Now the bill for that decision has arrived. President Donald Trump has made breaking that dependency one of the defining economic and national security missions of his second term, and the administration is not being subtle about it. Since January 2026, Washington has signed executive orders, launched a $12 billion stockpiling program, poured billions of dollars into private mining and processing companies, opened the door to mining the ocean floor, and started leaning on allies from Australia to Brazil to help fill the gap. But here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of the headlines. America is trying to rebuild in a few years what China spent decades constructing, and right now it is not ready. Let's start with the numbers, because they explain why this suddenly became urgent. A government assessment released in early 2026 found the United States was completely import dependent, 100%, for 12 critical minerals. And for another 29 minerals, the country relied on imports for at least half of what it consumes. By August, officials were citing an even blunter figure, that the U.S. was fully import reliant on 16 of the 60 minerals considered essential to national security. Even minerals that are physically mined inside American borders often get shipped overseas anyway, because the domestic processing capacity to turn them into usable material simply does not exist yet. That is the trap. You can dig something out of American soil and still be dependent on a foreign country to make it useful. Now imagine you are a procurement manager at a mid-sized American defense contractor. Call her Elena. Elena's company builds components that end up inside advanced weapon systems, guidance electronics, precision sensors. Washington has told her industry, in no uncertain terms, that reliance on Chinese-sourced rare earths, magnets, tungsten, molybdenum, and tantalum has to end. There's even a hard deadline attached to it, January 1st, 2027. Elena starts calling around for alternative suppliers, and what she finds is sobering. Some of the companies being championed as America's rare earth future do not have commercial scale production yet. One executive running a mineral refining company told reporters this year that his own facility, originally planned to start refining in 2025, has been pushed back and now might not begin some production until 2027 at the earliest. His quote was blunt: "Can the entire supply chain be propped up in time? That is going to be a battle." That is the real texture of this story. Not a simple binary of America succeeding or failing, but a frantic, expensive, uneven race against a deadline that may have been set faster than physical infrastructure can actually be built. So how did we get here? Rewind to January 15th, 2026. Trump signs an executive order adjusting imports of processed critical minerals and their derivative products. It directs you, trade officials, to negotiate agreements with allied countries covering processed minerals, with tariffs as the punishment if those negotiations fail to produce results. It is modeled on the same legal tool, Section 232, that Washington previously used on steel and aluminum, except this time the target is not cheap foreign dumping. The target is strategic dependency itself. Then, in July, Trump signs another order, this one aimed squarely at defense supply chains, directing military contractors to move away from Beijing-linked mineral sources starting in January 2027. The order does not name China directly, but nobody reading it is confused about who it is talking about. It states plainly that the United States must secure its supply chains against physical, cyber, and economic subversion. Behind these orders sits Project Vault, a $12 billion plan to build a literal government-held stockpile of critical minerals, financed partly through Export-Import Bank lending and partly through private capital. And here is where it gets interesting, almost contradictory. Officials admitted in April that to fill this strategic American stockpile, they would initially need to buy minerals from, in their words, anywhere in the world, including China. Read that again. The stockpile built to reduce American dependence on China may need Chinese material to get off the ground in its first phase. That is not hypocrisy exactly. It is physics and economics colliding with political timelines. You cannot manufacture 5 years of refining capacity in 5 months, no matter how many press conferences you hold. Meanwhile, the pressure from the private sector keeps building. Lockheed Martin's chief executive said publicly that his company has already handed the Pentagon a wish list of minerals it wants, included in the national stockpile. That is a defense giant essentially telling Washington, we are worried too. Please stockpile faster. Congress has been moving too, not just the White House. In February 2026, the House of Representatives passed a bill called the Securing America's Critical Mineral Supply Act, which directs the Department of Energy to actively secure supplies of critical energy resources, including rare earth elements, treating them as a matter of energy security rather than simple commerce. Around the same time, Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a critical minerals ministerial in Washington, gathering allied governments together to coordinate on exactly this issue, a sign that the administration sees this as diplomacy, not just domestic industrial policy. And on the trade side, Washington and Mexico agreed to an action plan under the existing North American Trade Agreement specifically aimed at coordinating policy on critical mineral vulnerabilities across the continent, treating Canada and Mexico less like separate markets and more like extensions of a single North American mineral base. All of that matters because it shows this is not one executive order sitting alone. It is layered, deliberate, and touching trade law, defense procurement, energy policy, and foreign diplomacy all at once. Now let's talk about money, because the dollar figures involved are genuinely enormous. On August 7th, the White House announced more than $2 billion, some reports say closer to $3 billion, in new mining and mining-related projects, plus more than $180 million specifically for mining education and workforce training. Because here is a detail people often miss. Even if America builds the refineries, it needs thousands of trained metallurgists, chemical engineers, and skilled tradespeople who currently do not exist in the domestic workforce at the scale required. Within that same announcement, the Pentagon revealed it was investing $1.4 billion in a battery facility and $400 million to expand scandium production for aerospace use. And $150 million went to a Minnesota company called Niron Magnetics, which is trying to build permanent magnets that do not rely on rare earths at all. Think about that for a second. One entire branch of this strategy is not just about mining more rare earths. It is about engineering around the need for them in the first place. If Niron or companies like it succeed, an entire category of Chinese leverage simply becomes less relevant because the technology stops requiring the material China dominates. That is a much longer bet, but potentially a far more durable one. Now, China has not been sitting quietly watching any of this happen. On June 22, 2026, Beijing's Ministry of Commerce added 10 American companies to its export control list, banning the export of so-called dual-use items, technology or materials, with both civilian and military applications, to those firms. Two of the names on that list are not obscure companies. They are MP Materials and USA Rare Earth, arguably the two flagship companies Washington has been counting on to build a domestic rare earth supply chain. Think about the message embedded in that move. China did not target random American companies. It targeted the specific companies America is relying on to escape Chinese dependence. Officially, Beijing framed the action as retaliation for the U.S., adding a batch of Chinese firms, including some very large and recognizable technology and automotive names, to a Pentagon list of companies allegedly tied to the Chinese military. Beneath the diplomatic language, the real message is simpler. We can still reach into your supply chain whenever we choose to. China's move followed a separate but related escalation. The U.S. Department of Defense had recently updated what is known as its Section 1260H list, a Pentagon roster of companies it says are linked to the Chinese military, adding dozens of well-known Chinese technology and automotive names to it. Once a company lands on that list, the Pentagon is barred from entering into, renewing, or extending contracts involving it. Beijing's export control response arrived within days, and it was not random retaliation. It specifically targeted the American companies most central to the Rare Earth Independence Project. On the same day, China restricted those 10 companies. It also quietly added 46 additional American firms to a separate government procurement restriction list, a second layer of pressure that received far less coverage but expanded the scope of the confrontation considerably. Chinese officials also tightened enforcement more broadly during this period, including reports of foreign nationals detained on suspicion of smuggling export-controlled, rare earth-related materials, a signal that Beijing intends to police this boundary aggressively, not just symbolically. This is the paradox sitting at the center of the entire story. The harder Washington tries to escape Chinese mineral dependence, the more aggressively Beijing demonstrates it still has leverage over the very companies trying to build the escape route. And the faster America tries to move, the more visible its own unpreparedness becomes. Consider what it actually takes to replace China's rare earth magnet ecosystem. It is not one factory. It is mines or processing plants, chemical separation facilities capable of splitting apart chemically similar elements, metal reduction plants, magnet manufacturing lines, a trained workforce for every one of those stages, transportation and logistics networks, and finally, customers willing to pay significantly more for materials that used to be cheap because Chinese producers had already absorbed decades of infrastructure cost. Reuters reported in July that the U.S. government has now funneled tens of billions of dollars across roughly 150 different mineral companies trying to build exactly that ecosystem. And still, industry insiders are warning the January 2027 deadline is not realistic for the entire chain. One estimate circulating in industry circles put annual U.S. demand for common rare earth magnets at around 48,000 metric tons. Domestic supply, roughly 300 tons. Even accounting for imprecision in that kind of estimate, the gap is not something you close with a press release. So what happens on January 1st, 2027 if the domestic supply chain genuinely is not ready? There are basically three paths. Washington could grant temporary waivers again, which it has done repeatedly for years whenever domestic supply could not meet demand, essentially delaying the deadline in practice even while keeping it on paper. Washington could hold firm on the deadline and risk real supply disruptions for defense manufacturers and other critical industries. Or Washington could quietly lean harder on allied countries to bridge the gap, treating friendly foreign supply as functionally equivalent to domestic supply, even if that stretches the spirit of the original goal. All three paths carry political risk. Waivers make the tough talk look hollow. Holding firm risks real economic pain. And leaning on allies means admitting the goal was never truly full independence, just diversification away from a single adversary. Let's go back to Elena for a moment, because her situation captures the day-to-day reality behind all these headlines better than any government statistic can. Her company cannot simply wait around for the supply chain to sort itself out on Washington's timeline. So she is doing what procurement managers everywhere are quietly doing right now, running three strategies in parallel. She is applying for whatever temporary waivers might still be available if domestic and allied supply cannot meet the January deadline in time. She is working with engineers to redesign certain components so they need less of the specific restricted material, or a substitute material entirely. And she is signing longer-term contracts with the emerging alternative suppliers now, even at a higher price, essentially betting that being an early customer secures her a place in line before the rest of the industry realizes how tight capacity is about to become. Multiply Elena's situation across hundreds of defense contractors, electronics manufacturers, automakers, and industrial companies, and you start to see what this transition actually looks like on the ground. Not a clean policy rollout, but a scramble. Company by company, contract by contract. This brings us to one of the more surprising chapters of the story, the ocean floor. The Trump administration has proposed opening federal waters around the northern Mariana Islands and separately around American Samoa to deep sea mining leases. The Marine Minerals Administration published a formal leasing notice covering roughly 67 million acres of seabed near the Marianas, with an auction tentatively planned for December 2026. The pitch is straightforward. The ocean floor in parts of the Pacific contains nodules rich in exactly the kind of battery and defense-relevant minerals America is trying to secure. But the pushback has been intense. More than 60,000 public comments, petitions, and letters opposing the plan have already been logged from residents, indigenous advocacy groups, and environmental organizations. Critics argue that deep ocean ecosystems remain scientifically understudied, that mining could cause irreversible habitat destruction, sediment plumes, and pollution that spreads far beyond the actual mining site, and that indigenous Pacific communities are once again being asked to absorb environmental risk for a resource rush they did not ask for. Supporters counter that these seabed nodules represent a genuinely new source of minerals for batteries, electronics, and military hardware, one that does not require competing with China for land-based deposits at all. Whether this becomes a meaningful supply source or gets tied up in years of litigation and local opposition is honestly still an open question. Now let's go south to Brazil. Brazil sits on the second largest known rare earth reserves on the planet, trailing only China and by a significant amount. Recent industry data puts China's share of global reserves at roughly 49%, with Brazil at around 23%. That is still enormous. An Associated Press analysis of Brazilian mining permit filings found that rare earth exploration applications there have surged dramatically, with more than 86% of all such filings in the last decade happening in just the past 3 years alone. American companies rank second only to Brazilian applicants themselves in filing for these permits. One company, USA Rare Earth, the same firm China just placed export restrictions on, announced an agreement earlier this year to acquire a Brazilian operation called Serra Verde, which happens to be the only rare earth producer outside of Asia currently capable of supplying all 4 of the magnetic rare earth elements used in high-performance permanent magnets. The company's stated ambition, in its own words, is to become the premier new source of rare earth supply for America. Australia is circling too, with its ambassador to Brazil publicly acknowledging that the current mineral supply landscape is, in her words, quite concentrated, without needing to say which country she meant. Notably, as of this past summer, Chinese companies had filed essentially zero rare earth mining applications in Brazil, even though Chinese firms have shown clear interest and already control other Brazilian mining assets in different commodities. That absence is not an accident. It looks a lot like two global powers quietly positioning themselves in the same resource-rich country, both aware of what is at stake, neither wanting to tip their hand too early. Environmental groups in Brazil are raising the same warnings we hear elsewhere, that some of this exploration edges close to the Amazon rainforest and indigenous territory, and that a resource rush driven by geopolitics can move faster than the environmental safeguards meant to contain it. Nearly half of all rare earth exploration applications filed in Brazil recently came from subsidiaries of foreign companies or firms with foreign ownership. A striking figure that shows just how internationalized this particular resource rush has already become long before a single new mine reaches full commercial production. Brazil's own government has been careful, almost deliberately neutral, about where it positions itself in all of this. Officials overseeing the country's rare earth policy have publicly said Brazil does not intend to take sides in the broader US-China dispute, which is a diplomatically savvy position for a country suddenly sitting on some of the most sought-after mineral reserves on the planet. It lets Brazil negotiate with both Washington and Beijing simultaneously, playing suitors against each other rather than committing early to one camp. That is exactly the kind of leverage smaller and mid-sized resource-rich nations are learning to use in this new era. Australia, Canada, Brazil, even countries in Africa with major cobalt and lithium deposits, all discovering that being caught between two competing superpowers over minerals can be turned into genuine negotiating power rather than just a geopolitical burden. Back home, the money keeps flowing. On August 20th, the Department of Energy announced $500 million in grants spread across 7 companies working on lithium extraction, cobalt refining, and battery material recycling. Lilac Solutions received $100 million to build a commercial lithium extraction and refining facility on Utah's Great Salt Lake, aiming to double existing domestic lithium output. Jervois, a company that controls a significant cobalt deposit in Idaho and had actually gone through a bankruptcy restructuring just last year because of low global cobalt prices, received $100 million to build what would become the country's only cobalt refinery, material used in batteries, electronics, and a wide range of weapon systems. Nth Cycle, a battery recycling company backed by the commodities trading firm Trafigura, received $100 million to build a facility processing what is called black mass, the shredded remains of used batteries packed with recoverable lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Notably, the administration had already moved earlier this same month to block the export of black mass overseas, essentially forcing that recyclable material to stay inside the United States rather than being shipped abroad for processing. 4 smaller companies, Princeton New Energy, Arcanum Ventures, Elevated Materials, and Core Shell Technologies, split the remaining funding across projects covering cathode recycling, electrolyte chemicals, lithium metal materials, and silicon anode battery technology. There is also a tungsten-specific angle worth understanding, because tungsten rarely gets the same attention as rare earth magnets, but is arguably just as critical. It is used in armor-piercing ammunition, cutting tools, drill bits, and a wide range of industrial and defense applications. And China's export restrictions on tungsten earlier this year specifically pushed Western governments and several Gulf states to scramble for alternative sources almost overnight. A smaller scale preview of what a full rare earth cutoff might look like. Notice the pattern here. This is not only about digging more out of the ground. It is about building an entire alternative ecosystem, extraction, refining, recycling, and new material science all at once on parallel tracks. That is either an incredibly smart, diversified strategy or an extremely expensive scattershot approach, depending on which analyst you ask. And there are real skeptics. Some critics describe the overall approach as a potential trap, warning that the U.S., government's roughly $1 billion, and counting, in direct taxpayer-funded equity stakes in mining and materials, companies raises real questions about market distortion, about picking corporate winners and losers, and about what happens if some of these subsidized companies simply cannot compete once the geopolitical urgency fades. Congressional oversight committees have already begun raising exactly those questions. Other analysts argue the entire framing around simply mining more is too narrow, and that the real long-term answer involves recycling, material substitution, and next-generation battery chemistries that reduce dependence on the most contested minerals altogether, things like cobalt-free lithium iron phosphate batteries or sodium-ion alternatives that sidestep lithium entirely. In other words, part of this fight is not just where do we get the minerals, but do we even need as many of them in the first place? Stepping back, it helps to understand exactly where China's advantage actually lives. The International Energy Agency estimates China holds around 61% of global mined rare earth supply, but a staggering 91% of global refining and processing capacity for major rare earths. For cobalt, graphite, and several other critical materials, Chinese processing dominance runs close to 90% as well. That gap between mining share and processing share is the entire story in one statistic. China does not just dig up more. It controls the choke point every other country's raw material has to pass through to become useful. And that is precisely why simply opening new mines in Nevada or Texas or Idaho does not automatically solve the problem. Without matching investment in separation and refining capacity, American mine ore can end up taking a long, expensive detour through foreign processing facilities anyway, sometimes even Chinese ones, before it comes back as a usable industrial input. This is also why the Trump administration has been trying to build what amounts to a mineral alliance rather than a purely domestic solution. Washington has pursued coordinated trade actions with Mexico and Canada under existing North American trade frameworks, specifically targeting mineral supply chain vulnerabilities. It has hosted international mineral security summits, bringing together allied governments to discuss joint stockpiling and processing investment. And officials openly acknowledge they are, in some sense, copying the very model China used to build its own dominance in the first place. Patient, coordinated, government-backed industrial policy sustained over many years, rather than leaving it entirely to short-term market forces. The irony is not lost on policy analysts who study this space closely. For decades, Western economic orthodoxy treated that kind of state-directed industrial planning as inefficient, something free markets were supposed to do better on their own. China ignored that orthodoxy, built overwhelming structural advantage in an entire category of strategic materials, and is now watching the country that once championed pure market logic try to build its own version of state-directed industrial policy in response. So where does this actually leave things? Here's the more realistic way to think about the end goal, according to many of the analysts following this closely. The point may never have been to completely eliminate Chinese material from American supply chains by some fixed date. Total independence in every mineral immediately was probably never physically achievable on this kind of timeline, no matter how much money got thrown at it. The more realistic goal is resilience. Enough domestic and allied production capacity that if China ever chose to fully weaponize its mineral dominance, cutting off supply entirely during some future crisis, American defense manufacturing and critical industries would not simply grind to a halt. Diversification, not full replacement. Redundancy, not total self-sufficiency. That is a much more achievable target, even if it is a far less dramatic headline than declaring total mineral independence from China. And there's a reason this fight matters so much beyond just mining stock prices or defense contractor supply chains. Critical minerals sit underneath essentially every strategically important technology of this decade. Artificial intelligence hardware, electric vehicles and their batteries, advanced robotics, satellite systems, next-generation telecommunications, precision-guided weapons, offshore wind and solar infrastructure. Whoever controls the mineral inputs for those industries has real leverage over how fast, how cheaply, and under what political conditions those industries get to grow in other countries. China understood this decades before most Western governments did, and built accordingly, patiently, over a generation. Washington is now trying to build an equivalent foundation in a fraction of that time, racing against a self-imposed January 2027 deadline that increasingly looks aspirational rather than fully achievable, while simultaneously fighting environmental opposition at home, diplomatic friction with trading partners abroad, and a rival in Beijing that has already shown it is willing to use its remaining leverage the moment it feels threatened. There is a version of this story where it works. Domestic mines scale up, new refineries actually get built and permitted on schedule, magnet alternatives like Niren's technology mature into real commercial products. Brazil and Australia and Canada become dependable, long-term partners. Recycling captures a meaningful share of demand. And within 5 to 10 years, America has genuinely durable, diversified mineral supply chains for the first time in decades. There's also a version where permitting delays, funding gaps, community opposition, technical setbacks, and Chinese countermeasures combine to make the 2027 deadline just another missed target, quietly extended through waivers, while the underlying dependency persists in a slightly reshuffled form. Both versions are plausible right now, neither is guaranteed. What is clear is that the era of treating critical minerals as a boring back-office commodity issue is completely over. It is now squarely a national security issue, an industrial policy issue, an environmental issue, and a geopolitical bargaining chip all at the same time. And the outcome of this specific race over specific minerals in specific factories being built or delayed right now across Nevada, Texas, Idaho, Utah, the Pacific seabed, and the Brazilian interior is going to help decide which country holds the upper hand in the technologies that define the next several decades of the global economy. China built its advantage slowly, deliberately over 30 years, largely while the rest of the world was not paying close attention. America is now trying to build its answer to that advantage in a handful of years, in full public view, under enormous political pressure, with a rival that is actively pushing back at every step. That is an extraordinarily difficult position to be in, but it is not an impossible one. The next 18 months, running right up to and past that January 2027 deadline, are going to reveal a great deal about whether American industrial policy can actually move at the speed its own political rhetoric demands. Because announcing billions of dollars is the easy part. Turning those announcements into working mines, functioning refineries, trained engineers, and finished magnets rolling off an American production line on a timeline that actually matters, that is the far harder test still waiting to happen. Watch the permitting offices, not just the press conferences. Watch whether Niron and companies like it actually get rare earth-free magnets into real products at scale, or whether that stays a promising lab result for another few years. Watch whether the Mariana Islands lease sale in December actually happens on schedule, or gets delayed by the tens of thousands of public comments already stacked against it. Watch whether Elena and procurement managers, just like her across the defense industry, end up getting quiet waivers again in January, or whether Washington actually holds the line this time. Every one of those small, unglamorous decisions, made in permitting offices and defense procurement departments and corporate boardrooms far from the White House podium, is going to matter more than any single announcement. Because the real contest here was never just about who mines the most. It has always been about who controls the choke points, who builds the boring, expensive, unglamorous infrastructure fast enough to matter, and who is still standing with a functioning supply chain the next time geopolitical tension turns into an actual crisis. China answered that question a generation ago. America is still writing its answer, one refinery, one lease sale, one export control retaliation at a time.